No roads, no stores, no safety net. Out there in the wilderness, families faced a simple choice: build a life from nothing or lose everything. But look closer at that log cabin. Smoke rising from the stone chimney. Children playing safely in the cleared yard. Hunters returning with fresh game slung over their shoulders. Fields of golden grain stretching toward the forest edge. This isn't just survival. This is prosperity carved from virgin wilderness. They needed cabins that could shelter generations built to last from the forest around them. They needed systems that turned hostile wilderness into productive paradise. Every decision mattered. One failed harvest, one poorly built cabin, one harsh winter without proper preparation, and an entire family legacy could crumble. The families who built these forest empires had to be smart. They had to be systematic. But how did they develop sophisticated water management, agricultural systems, and preservation techniques without modern machinery or infrastructure? How did they create self-sustaining paradises that supported not just survival but prosperity for generations? Today we're exploring the sophisticated methods pioneer families used to turn the American wilderness into the foundation of a continental empire. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Between 1862 and 1900, over 1.6 million families claimed homesteads under the Homestead Act, transforming more than 270 million acres of wilderness into productive agricultural land. But the popular image of isolated families struggling alone against nature misses the real story. These weren't desperate refugees gambling on empty land. They were participants in the largest coordinated land development project in human history, using techniques and systems that had been refined through generations of European agricultural knowledge, combined with hard-won lessons from Native American land management practices. The Knowledge Network. The transformation of the American wilderness didn't begin with the Homestead Act of 1862. It started decades earlier, in the minds of agricultural reformers and land speculators who understood that successful colonization required more than just giving away free land. It required a systematic approach to land development that could turn raw prairie into productive farms within a single generation. The knowledge base came from multiple sources. European immigrants brought centuries of agricultural wisdom from the intensive farming systems of Germany, Scandinavia, and the British Isles. These weren't subsistence farmers. They were practitioners of advanced agricultural techniques that had been refined through generations of careful observation and experimentation. Crop rotation systems, soil management, selective breeding of livestock, and sophisticated preservation methods were already well-established sciences in Europe. But European knowledge alone wasn't enough. The American prairie presented challenges that no European farmer had ever faced. Endless grassland with root systems so dense that steel plows broke against them. Soil so rich it could grow anything, but weather so extreme it could destroy everything. Distances so vast that traditional European village systems simply couldn't function. The solution came from an unexpected source: Native American land management practices that had been sustaining complex agricultural societies for over 1,000 years. Tribes like the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara had developed sophisticated systems for managing prairie ecosystems, including controlled burning, selective harvesting, and integrated agriculture that worked with natural cycles rather than against them. The real breakthrough came when government land agents, agricultural colleges, and immigrant communities began systematically documenting and sharing these combined techniques. The Morrill Act of 1862 established land-grant colleges specifically to develop and teach scientific agriculture. Agricultural societies formed networks that shared information across vast distances through newsletters, traveling lecturers, and demonstration farms. We are not merely settlers, but the advance guard of civilization, armed with knowledge that our fathers never possessed, wrote agricultural reformer John Wesley Powell in 1869. This wasn't random settlement. It was coordinated development. The railroad companies played a crucial role in this knowledge transfer. They had millions of acres of land grants to sell, and empty land was worthless. So they invested heavily in agricultural education, providing free transportation for agricultural experts, distributing translated farming manuals in multiple languages, and even establishing model farms along their routes to demonstrate successful techniques. By the 1870s, a sophisticated information network connected farming communities across the continent. Successful techniques developed in Minnesota were being implemented in Kansas within months. Innovations in water management from Colorado were being adapted for use in Nebraska. Seed varieties that proved successful in one region were being distributed to similar climates hundreds of miles away. This knowledge sharing created a standardized approach to land transformation that could be replicated across different regions with predictable results. Pioneer families weren't gambling on unknown techniques. They were implementing proven systems that had been tested and refined by thousands of other families facing similar challenges. The systematic transformation process. The actual process of transforming wild land into a self-sustaining homestead followed a carefully planned sequence that had been refined through decades of trial and error. This wasn't random clearing and planting, it was systematic ecosystem engineering that required precise timing, careful resource management, and deep understanding of natural cycles. The first year was all about establishing the foundation systems that would support everything else. Water came first, because nothing else mattered without reliable access to clean water. Pioneer families didn't just dig wells randomly. They studied the landscape, observed vegetation patterns, and used techniques passed down from generations of well diggers to locate the most reliable water sources. Shelter came next, but not the log cabins of popular imagination. In prairie regions where trees were scarce, families built sophisticated sod houses that provided better insulation than wood construction, required no imported materials, and could be expanded systematically as the family's needs grew. These weren't primitive dugouts. They were engineered structures with proper drainage, ventilation systems, and modular design that allowed for systematic expansion. The agricultural system was based on a three-phase development plan that maximized productivity while building soil health. The first phase focused on breaking the prairie sod and establishing basic food crops that could provide immediate sustenance. The second phase introduced cash crops that could generate income for purchasing tools, livestock, and additional land. The third phase implemented sophisticated rotation systems that maintained soil fertility while maximizing long-term productivity. Livestock integration was planned from the beginning, not added as an afterthought. Cattle, pigs, and chickens weren't just sources of meat and dairy. They were essential components of a closed-loop system that converted agricultural waste into fertilizer, provided power for heavy work, and created multiple income streams that protected families against crop failures. The preservation and storage systems were equally sophisticated. Root cellars weren't just holes in the ground. They were precisely engineered structures that maintained specific temperature and humidity levels year-round. Smokehouse design, salt curing techniques, and fermentation methods allowed families to preserve massive quantities of food without refrigeration, creating food security that could last through multiple bad harvests. Every element of the homestead serves multiple purposes, and every waste product becomes an input for another system, noted agricultural inspector James Wilson in 1885. This integrated approach created resilience that allowed families to survive disasters that would have destroyed less sophisticated operations. The community coordination aspect was perhaps the most crucial element. Families didn't work in isolation. They participated in carefully organized networks that shared labor, resources, and expertise. Barn raisings, harvest crews, and equipment sharing allowed individual families to accomplish tasks that would have been impossible working alone. Tool and equipment sharing was organized through informal but highly effective networks that ensured expensive machinery like threshing equipment, well drilling rigs, and heavy plows were available to multiple families throughout the growing season. This cooperative approach allowed small homesteads to access the same level of technology and efficiency as much larger operations. The water management system. Sarah Whitman watches her husband Thomas pace around their claim, stopping every few yards to examine the grass, the soil, the subtle changes in elevation that most people would never notice. He's not looking for the best spot to build their house. He's hunting for water. Because without water, nothing else matters. The nearest stream is 3 miles away, and hauling water for a family, livestock, and crops over that distance would be a death sentence. But Thomas isn't guessing. He's using techniques passed down from generations of well diggers, combined with knowledge gained from local Native American tribes who had been finding water on these plains for centuries. He's looking for specific vegetation patterns. Cottonwood trees that only grow where groundwater is close to the surface, certain types of grass that indicate underground springs, and subtle depressions in the land that suggest ancient watercourses. The well-digging process itself was a sophisticated engineering operation that required precise planning and specialized tools. Pioneer families didn't just dig holes and hope for the best. They used dowsing techniques to locate the most promising spots, then employed a systematic approach to well construction that ensured clean, reliable water for decades. The typical homestead well was 15 to 30 feet deep, lined with carefully fitted stones to prevent contamination and collapse. The construction required understanding of soil layers, water table dynamics, and structural engineering that most modern homeowners would find challenging. But for pioneer families, this knowledge was literally a matter of life and death. Water storage and distribution systems were equally sophisticated. Families constructed elaborate cistern systems that captured and stored rainwater, complete with filtration systems using sand, charcoal, and gravel that produced water cleaner than many modern municipal systems. Irrigation networks used gravity-fed systems and carefully engineered channels that could distribute water across entire farms without mechanical pumps. A good well is worth more than gold, because gold cannot make crops grow or keep livestock alive, wrote homesteader Mary Johnson in her diary in 1878. The 3-field rotation system. The morning sun reveals the geometric precision of the Whitman farm. 3 distinct fields arranged in a pattern that would have been familiar to medieval European farmers, but adapted for the unique challenges of the American prairie. This isn't random agriculture. This is a sophisticated system that maintains soil fertility while maximizing productivity year after year. Field rotation was the foundation of sustainable prairie agriculture, but it required understanding of soil chemistry, plant biology, and ecosystem management that took years to master. The basic principle was simple. Different crops depleted and restored different nutrients in the soil, so rotating crops in a planned sequence maintained fertility without expensive fertilizers. The first field grew nitrogen-fixing crops like beans, peas, and clover that actually improved the soil while producing food. These legumes formed symbiotic relationships with soil bacteria that converted atmospheric nitrogen into forms that plants could use, essentially manufacturing fertilizer from thin air. The second field grew heavy-feeding crops like corn, wheat, and potatoes that required rich soil but produced the bulk of the family's food and cash crops. These crops were planted in the field that had been enriched by the previous year's nitrogen-fixing crops. The third field was left fallow, but not empty. It was planted with specific grasses and herbs that prevented erosion, suppressed weeds, and continued building soil health. This wasn't wasted land. It was an investment in future productivity. The timing and sequencing of this rotation required careful planning and record-keeping. Families maintained detailed logs of what was planted where, when it was harvested, and how the soil responded. This information guided decisions about crop selection, planting dates, and field management that could make the difference between prosperity and starvation. Advanced practitioners developed variations that included 4, 5, or even 6 field rotations that incorporated livestock grazing, specialized cash crops, and soil building techniques that created some of the most productive agricultural land in the world. The integrated livestock system. The sound of cattle lowing mingles with the clucking of chickens and the occasional grunt of pigs as Thomas Whitman makes his morning rounds. But this isn't just a collection of farm animals. It's a carefully orchestrated system where every species serves multiple purposes and the waste from one becomes the input for another. Cattle weren't just sources of meat and dairy, they were living tractors that could break prairie sod that steel plows couldn't handle, mobile fertilizer factories that converted grass into rich manure, and walking food storage that could survive harsh winters when crops failed. The key was understanding how to integrate cattle into the agricultural system without letting them destroy the very land they were supposed to improve. Rotational grazing was the secret. Instead of letting cattle roam freely and overgraze the best areas while ignoring others, pioneer families developed systematic grazing patterns that moved livestock through different areas on a planned schedule. This prevented overgrazing, distributed manure evenly across the land, and actually improved grass quality by mimicking the natural grazing patterns of buffalo herds. Pigs served as living garbage disposals that converted kitchen scraps, damaged crops, and agricultural waste into high-quality protein. But they also served as land-clearing specialists that could root out stumps, clear brush, and prepare new ground for cultivation. The trick was controlling where they worked and when they moved on. Chickens were the ultimate multi-purpose livestock. They provided eggs and meat, but they also controlled insect pests, cleaned up spilled grain, and produced high-nitrogen fertilizer that was perfect for vegetable gardens. Free-range chickens could find much of their own food while providing valuable services to the farm ecosystem. The integration of these different species required understanding of animal behavior, pasture management, and timing that took years to master. But families who got it right created self-sustaining systems that required minimal external inputs while producing abundant food, fiber, and income. Every animal on the farm works for its keep, and every waste product finds a use, noted agricultural inspector William Morrison in 1883. The Forest Management Program. Even on the treeless prairie, successful homesteaders understood that trees were essential for long-term success. But creating forests where none existed required understanding of tree biology, soil preparation, and long-term planning that most modern landowners would find daunting. Windbreak establishment was the first priority. Prairie winds could destroy crops, dry out soil, and make life miserable for both humans and livestock. But the right trees, planted in the right patterns, could create microclimates that protected entire farms while providing timber, fuel, and wildlife habitat. Tree selection required understanding of local climate, soil conditions, and growth patterns. Fast-growing species like cottonwood and willow provided quick protection and early timber harvests. Slower-growing hardwoods like oak and maple were investments in future generations, providing high-quality lumber and long-term windbreak protection. Planting techniques had to account for the harsh prairie environment where young trees faced drought, wind, fire, and grazing pressure that would kill most seedlings. Pioneer families developed sophisticated protection systems using brush shelters, irrigation networks, and grazing management that gave young trees the protection they needed to establish. Timber harvesting was planned from the beginning, with trees planted in patterns that allowed for selective cutting that maintained windbreak protection while providing a steady supply of lumber, fence posts, and fuel. This required understanding of forest ecology and long-term planning that treated the forest as a crop that happened to take decades to mature. The most successful homesteaders created integrated forest systems that provided multiple benefits: windbreak protection, timber production, wildlife habitat, erosion control, and even maple syrup or fruit production. These weren't just tree plantings. They were engineered ecosystems that improved the entire farm operation. The Community Workshop Network. The sound of hammering echoes across the prairie as neighbors gather at the Whitman homestead for a barn raising. But this isn't just community cooperation. It's a sophisticated economic system that allows individual families to access tools, skills, and labor that would be impossible to maintain alone. The workshop network was based on specialization and exchange. Not every family could afford a complete set of tools, but every community could support specialists who owned expensive equipment and rented it out or provided services. The blacksmith, the carpenter, the well digger, and the miller formed the backbone of a service economy that made individual homesteads viable. Tool sharing was organized through informal but highly effective networks that ensured expensive machinery was available when needed. A threshing machine might serve 20 families during harvest season, moving from farm to farm on a carefully coordinated schedule. Plows, harrows, and other heavy equipment were shared among neighbors who couldn't justify the expense of individual ownership. Skill sharing was equally important. Experienced farmers taught newcomers the techniques that meant the difference between success and failure. Women shared knowledge about food preservation, textile production, and household management that was essential for family survival. Children learned by working alongside adults, absorbing knowledge that would serve them throughout their lives. Labor exchange allowed families to accomplish tasks that required more workers than any individual household could provide. Barn raisings, harvest crews, and land clearing operations brought together dozens of workers who contributed their labor in exchange for similar help when they needed it. The timing and coordination of these networks required sophisticated planning and communication. Families had to balance their own needs with their obligations to neighbors, coordinate schedules across multiple households, and maintain the trust and reciprocity that made the system work. No family succeeds alone on the frontier, and no community fails when families work together, wrote Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford in 1871. The preservation and storage systems. Sarah Whitman descends into the root cellar, her lantern casting dancing shadows on walls lined with shelves of preserved food. Barrels of salt pork, crocks of sauerkraut, strings of dried vegetables, and wheels of cheese represent months of careful work and the difference between abundance and starvation during the long prairie winter. Food preservation wasn't just about preventing spoilage. It was about creating a food storage system that could maintain nutrition, flavor, and safety for months or even years without refrigeration. This required understanding of food chemistry, microbiology, and storage techniques that most modern families have completely forgotten. Root cellars were precisely engineered structures that maintained specific temperature and humidity levels year-round. The depth, ventilation, drainage, and construction materials were all calculated to create an environment that kept vegetables fresh, prevented freezing, and controlled moisture without mechanical systems. Smoking and curing techniques transformed fresh meat into shelf-stable protein that could last for months. But this wasn't just hanging meat over a fire. It required understanding of salt chemistry, smoke composition, temperature control, and timing that took years to master. Different woods produced different flavors and preservation qualities, and the curing process had to be adjusted for weather, humidity, and the specific cut of meat. Fermentation was perhaps the most sophisticated preservation technique, using controlled bacterial action to create foods that were not only preserved but actually more nutritious than the original ingredients. Sauerkraut, pickles, cheese, and fermented dairy products provided essential vitamins and probiotics that maintained health through long winters when fresh food was unavailable. Drying and dehydration techniques removed moisture that bacteria needed to cause spoilage, creating lightweight, compact foods that could be stored for years. Fruits, vegetables, and even meat could be dried using techniques that preserved most of the nutritional value while dramatically extending storage life. The storage systems themselves required careful planning and construction. Different foods required different storage conditions, and the containers, shelving, and organization had to protect against rodents, insects, and environmental damage, while allowing for easy access and inventory management. The spring sun rises over the Whitman homestead, and the transformation is complete. Where once there was nothing but endless grass and wind, now there's a thriving farm with productive fields, healthy livestock, and a family that has not just survived, but prospered. The techniques that made this possible, the water management, the soil building, the integrated systems, these weren't primitive survival methods. They were sophisticated technologies that created the foundation for the most productive agricultural system in human history. The legacy of these pioneer families extends far beyond their individual homesteads. The techniques they developed and refined became the basis for modern sustainable agriculture, permaculture design, and integrated farming systems that are being rediscovered by farmers around the world. The community networks they created became the model for rural cooperation that still supports agricultural communities today. But perhaps the most important lesson from these pioneer families is that true self-sufficiency isn't about isolation, it's about integration. Integration of different crops, different animals, different skills, and different people into systems that are stronger and more resilient than any individual component. The families who succeeded understood that the land, the community, and the knowledge were all part of a single, interconnected system that had to be managed as a whole. The same principles that allowed pioneer families to transform wild prairie into productive farms are being used today by homesteaders, sustainable farmers, and even urban gardeners who want to create their own self-sustaining systems. The techniques may have been refined and the tools may have improved, but the fundamental understanding of how to work with natural systems rather than against them remains as relevant today as it was 150 years ago. If you want to learn more about the sophisticated hunting techniques that provided protein for these pioneer families, check out our episode on Native American buffalo hunting strategies. You'll find dozens of episodes waiting for you right here on Wild America.